So I can take off the post-it note on the front of my notes that said "Salute Shrine." It's so easy to forget. Yes, and it would be so inappropriate to forget on an evening when we're talking about Shinran, because, as I said, Shinran is a Japanese teacher on our Refuge Tree. And for Shinran, faith and orienting to the Buddha was absolutely central to his practice. And in a way, you might say that his only practice was saluting the Buddha again and again and again. So how terrible would that be if we forgot to salute the shrine? That would be awful. Right, okay, now I get to tell you all about Shinran. Okay, where are we going to start? Just to kind of give you the headline. So as I said, Shinran's practice is very, very much around faith. And he has a particular take on faith, and quite an extreme take, actually. And I'm probably somebody that quite likes extremes, but he's really not everyone's flavour. So it's like, just see what you make of it, and just kind of like see, oh, well, how would it be if I approach things like this? Or what would that be like? Okay. And of course, when we're talking about faith in a Buddhist sense, we are not talking about blind belief. We're talking about a kind of response of our whole body and heart-mind. And that includes an intellectual understanding like, oh, this makes sense. It includes a heart response, an intuition where it's just like, you hear a Buddhist teaching, or you see a beautiful Buddha, or you meet someone and you think, yes, like there's something in you that just says, yes, I want to go in that direction. Like, this is important. This is true. And that's an intuition or a heart response that we can trust. Like, there's something in us that does know when something is trustworthy. And then the third aspect of faith in a Buddhist sense is a sort of volitional aspect, where it's like we hear the teachings, we try them out, we realize they work, and then we think, yes, I can really put myself behind this. We long for what is possible. We think, yes, the Buddha said, if we do this, that will happen, and it's possible for me. So that's one way of talking about faith in a Buddhist sense. So I just wanted to make clear to start with, we're not talking about kind of blind belief. Now, Shinran has a rather different take, but we'll go there next. So what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to tell you the story about Shinran's life and what happened to him. And then we're going to go into, well, what was his take on the Dharma? And what would it be like if we had a go at practicing like that? And after I finish talking, hopefully we'll have time for some questions and maybe some discussion, see how it goes. And we'll finish the evening with a meditation. So that's where we're heading. Yeah. So Shinran lived in the 12th century in Japan. And I know you've been having a whole series on Pure Land and Amitabha and the Pure Land Sutras. Now, the Pure Land Sutras were written down around the 1st century Common Era. Shinran is living 1,000 years later, okay? So it's like things sort of start changing. The Pure Land tradition doesn't stay the same all the way along, and Shinran is kind of, it's at the far end of this flowering of a particular form of Buddhism. So, Shinran was born in 1173 to Lord and Lady Arinori, who are kind of like the minor aristocrats in Japan. And it's a very turbulent period in Japan at that time. There are epidemics, we can probably relate to that one. There are epidemics, there are famines, there are thousands of people dying. And Japan is just descending into several hundred years of civil war, where you've basically got just like different warlords fighting over the possession of different bits of Japan. So it's a very, very turbulent, unstable time that Shinran is born into. And he's orphaned young. Both his parents die. And at the age of 9 years old, he enters a monastery. Now, in the biographies, it says it's because he has this deep insight into impermanence. Both his parents have died, and he's just desperate to find out, well, what is the meaning of life when things, everything's so unstable, so turbulent, and my parents have just died. It's probably also one of the options if you're orphaned age 9 in Japan is to go into a monastery. So, but apparently, age 9, he writes this poem. Like the cherry blossom, the heart planning on tomorrow is ephemeral indeed. What sudden storm may not arise in the middle of the night? So he was very serious and very heartfelt about his Buddhist practice, and he really put all of him into it. So for the next 20 years, from age 9 to 29, he's living in a monastery. He's a Tendai monk, which is quite a broad tradition of Japanese Buddhism, which includes, all the basic teachings we'd know, also esoteric sort of tantric teachings, and also quite a strong thread of Pure Land practice. So he would be very familiar with the Pure Land Sutras. And so he tries all this really sincerely for 20 years, and he's got this real existential drive, like he needs to know, what is this life about? And at the age of 29, he's really hit a wall. He's totally hit a wall in his practice. He just feels like he's getting nowhere. He's a complete failure. He's been trying this as hard as he can, but he's not getting, he feels like insight isn't arising. He's not getting kinder. He's not getting more aware. Like, what's happening? He's not understanding impermanence. He just feels like, what am I doing? I just don't know what else to do. He gets stuck. And I think somebody with less deep insight into impermanence, or less of an existential need to practice, you just think, oh, well, I gave it a go. It's not working. Never mind. I'm going to disrobe. I'll leave the monastery. I'll just lead a normal life. Let's just try and kind of make this bit of the world safe and happy, and let's not worry about it. But Shinran can't do that. It's like he's on the horns of an existential dilemma. He can't let go of the Dharma. He can't let go of really wanting to go deeply into, what is life really about? And yet he feels that he's come up against a brick wall. He's totally stuck. This is me just going, which way do I go? I think for me, like if I think about like me practicing, certainly when I first met the Dharma, it just felt like I changed almost every week or every month. It's like, I started doing the Metta Bhavana, and it's like, wow, my relationships are transforming and I'm feeling more alive. And, I started getting a relationship with puja, which to start with I thought was the most bonkers thing anybody had ever suggested to me. And then suddenly it's like, wow, suddenly the universe feels like magic and I can't believe what's happening and this is really amazing. I didn't know things could open up like this. And I start becoming more aware and, just living life at a more vivid level and just at a practical level. Like I always used to try and cycle my bike away with it still padlocked to the railings, like that was the level of unmindfulness I had. And, I noticed my life was going more smoothly than it had done. And I think that carried on for like a number of years where it just felt like, I'm just seeing through all these patterns and making breakthroughs here. And wow, my life is transforming. And then after a number of years, it stopped feeling quite like that. And I think what it is like, to start off with, it's like there was a lot of stuff that could change quite quickly. And then it's like felt like I just hit a sort of bedrock of sanskaras, like deep patternings that have been probably like running on in me for lifetimes. And suddenly I was at a level where it's like these weren't going to shift in a hurry. So, anyhow, so I don't know what was happening for Shinran, but I imagine it was something like that. And certainly it's like, it felt like he'd got stuck. What was he going to do now? So what he does is he leaves his monastery and he goes to Kyoto, where there's a very famous temple, a hexagonal hall, and it has a great statue of the Bodhisattva Kannon, which is a female form of Avalokiteshvara, this embodiment of the compassion of all the Buddhas. And Shinran's, he's desperate. He doesn't know what to do. And he spends 100 days on retreat in this hall. And on the 95th day, he goes to sleep and he has a dream. And in this dream, Kannon appears to him. And Kannon appears to him and says, okay, you'll guess part of what he's struggling with when I tell you what Kannon says to him. If you want to sleep with a woman, I'll be your wife, and at death I'll lead you to the Pure Land. So you can imagine that if you're 29 years old and you're a young guy and you're asked to be celibate, this probably isn't the most straightforward thing in the whole world, okay? And actually a lot of the monks and nuns around that time, it's like they'd kind of pretend that they were keeping the monastic vows, but like off to the side, they'd have like a mistress, or they'd sort of secretly be having a household somewhere else. So there was quite a lot of kind of hypocrisy kind of built into the monastic system at that time. And all the monasteries had standing armies. It was crazy. Anyway, So Shinran has this dream. So I imagine this struggling with celibacy, it's like part of his sense of failure. And he must have had this question, do you have to be a monk or a nun to practice the Dharma seriously? Or actually, can you have a family? Can you have sexual partnerships? And actually, there's quite a lot of parallels with Sangha and Triratna and Shinran and the Jodo Shinshu movement. And one of them is that, Bhante had his own process of realizing that a serious Dharma life does not have to be identified with monasticism. And the Triratna ordination, well, it's neither monk nor lay. And later on, Shinran says exactly the same thing. He says, I am neither monk nor lay. So after this dream, Shinran takes this as a sign that he needs to completely change course. So he leaves his monastery for good, and he goes to find someone who'll be of deep significance to him. So this is another Buddhist teacher called Honen. So Honen says, whatever you do, recite the Nimbutsu, chant the name of the Buddha. If you can't do it as a monk, then take a wife. If you can't do it with a wife and children, then do it as a monk. So Honen is saying, follow the Dharma. That is what is most important. If you can't do it in your current conditions, change them. Good conditions are the ones that let you follow the Dharma. Don't worry what you're supposed to do. Find the conditions that are going to mean that you can follow the Dharma. So Honen had also been a Tendai monk, and he'd had a very similar spiritual crisis 25 years previously. And he'd gone to a library. People go to different places, don't they? He'd gone to the library and he read the whole library 5 times, every single book 5 times. I don't know how large the library was, but he was obviously quite keen. And on the 5th time, he came to this work which quoted Shantao, who is a Chinese Pure Land teacher, where he says, whether walking or standing, sitting or lying, only repeat the name of Amida with all your heart. Never cease the practice of it, even for a moment. Now, that really spoke to him. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you read a book and maybe you've read it before and suddenly like a sentence jumps out and you think, that's the teaching that I need. How did I miss it the other 3 times that I read this book? So this is what happened to Honen. Like, he heard what he needed to hear. And we're going to go into like what the teachings, what that style of practice looks like in a minute, but I'm just persevering with the story so we don't lose the thread of the story. So Honen too abandoned his monastic life, left his monastery, went to live in Kyoto, which was the major city in Japan at the time. And he started teaching just one practice, which is saying the Nimbutsu. So Nimbutsu means recollection of the Buddha. So Nem means recollection and Butsu, Buddha. So it's like the Chinese translation of Buddhanu Smriti, or recollection of the Buddha, and then it goes from China to Japan. And this consists of reciting Amida's name, Namo Amida Butsu, homage to the Buddha, the limitless Buddha. And hopefully you've already had a bit of a flavour of Amida as, well, in this sense, actually, we're not talking about Amitabha as like the red Buddha of love and compassion in the Tibetan tradition. We're talking about a figure that is like the principle of Buddhahood beyond space and time. Like you can, in fact, I'll tell you what, Muchinaga, could we have this picture of Amida Buddha up right now? So you could say Amida is our potential to become enlightened, which is always present, no matter where we are or, what era it is or where we are in space. Amida is present as like almost like an aspect of conditionality that says enlightenment is possible. And so this picture that you can see is a very, very famous rupa or statue of Amida Buddha from Japan. And Amida there is turning and he's holding open the gate to the Pure Land, and he's turning and he's calling all beings and saying, look, I'm holding the door for you. Come, come, realize your own true nature, realize your potential for wisdom and compassion. In the Japanese tradition, he's described as saying, come as you are, just, whoever you are, however you are, whatever's going on for you, just come as you are. He's like enlightenment calling to us. Okay, right, I think I'd like the people back. Great. Thank you. Yeah. So what Honen is teaching is the practice of calling on that embodied principle of enlightenment. And in a way, it's like if we chant Namo Amida Butsu, it's like it's us calling to Amida, which means the infinite or the limitless or the measureless. But also as we call, it's like we are being called. It's like a sort of two-way connection. We couldn't get enlightened if we weren't in a universe in which enlightenment was possible. Okay. So Honen abandons all other practices. So he says, ethics, you don't need to practice the precepts. Meditation, you don't need to meditate. Wisdom, you don't need to reflect on the nature of reality. You don't need to kind of reflect on impermanence or insubstantiality or unsatisfactoriness. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is chant to Amida. Okay. This was revolutionary in his time, and still now it's like I go to give a talk about Shinran and Honen, and it just sounds like they've taken the Dharma and they've thrown it out of the window. Okay, now I don't think this is actually what they've done, but it does sound like that's what they've done. And to be quite frank, I think Jodo Shinshu teaching, so this is pure Shinran's Pure Land School, they're very, very easy to misunderstand, okay? So just bear that in mind, okay? So if you get to the end of the talk and you think Mike Siddhi's saying don't follow the precepts and don't meditate and don't practice wisdom, like that's not what I'm saying, okay? It is what Honen was saying though. So this is fairly revolutionary, okay? This created waves in his own time. So all the other Buddhist schools, they're going, that's not Buddhist. And it also creates waves in society because, he's saying, he's undermining the moral basis for society. You don't need to practice ethics. And he's also saying this practice is open to everyone. And that was quite revolutionary at the time. So women were excluded from a lot of the temples, and you definitely couldn't go in a temple if you were menstruating. There was a slave class, and they didn't have access to religion in any way. There were untouchable classes who dealt with meat or dead bodies, and they were not even allowed to set foot in any of the temples. So how Buddhism had shown up in Japan at that time was very, very class-based. And it kind of looked like you could only practice the Dharma if you were a monk or a nun, or you were an aristocrat and you had loads of leisure time. So it looked like the Dharma was not available for everyone. And Honen was saying, no, anyone can do this. Anyone can become enlightened. And Amida wants anyone to come to the Pure Land. And this did not go down well with the status quo. You're undermining the status of the monks and the nuns. There's going to be revolution. and there probably was, actually. So, they weren't wrong. But his teachings were very popular, and they attracted people, a lot of people from the lower classes, but also a lot of people from the upper classes, aristocrats, a retired emperor, politicians. It had a very, very wide appeal because anyone could do this. So this is the man who Shinran goes and follows. And for the rest of his life, Shinran regards Honen as his teacher. He doesn't consider himself a teacher in his own right. and he says, "I, Shinran, do not have even a single disciple." So although nowadays Jodo Shinshu, it's like Shinran school, it's like the biggest Pure Land school in Japan. It has, many adherents. That didn't happen until like a couple of centuries after his death. He didn't set it up himself. So then what happened is there was a sex scandal in the Japanese court with a couple of Honen's disciples, and basically they slept with somebody that they shouldn't. And this was absolutely outrageous, and all Honen's opponents got the upper hand, and they persuaded the emperor to ban Honen's school. They executed a couple of the disciples, and they disrobed and exiled Honen and Shinran and some of the other disciples. So Shinran's forcibly disrobed, and he's sent off to the provinces, which is like, you've got to think medieval, very, very poor transport, very poor communications. And he goes off to the provinces. There's like fishing and farming villages. And there he marries. He has about 7 or 8 children. And he lives what looks like a normal life. He's not a monk anymore, but he doesn't consider himself just a layman either. He says, "I'm neither monk nor lay." And his monastic name is removed, and he's given a new name, but he doesn't use it. He calls himself Gutoku, which means the ignorant, stubble-headed one. So stubble-headed was a term of abuse for a monk that didn't follow their vows, or maybe they had an illicit mistress, or they took bribes or something like that. So he calls himself the ignorant, stubble-headed one. So 5 years later, the ban is lifted. He's allowed to move back to Kyoto. He doesn't go back straight away. But eventually he does move back to Kyoto. And really, for the whole rest of his life, he just lives as an ordinary person, but he just teaches anyone who comes his way, including, the local farmers and fishers. So there's slaves in his wife's household who become Jodo Shinshu priests, and a whole kind of grassroots spiritual movement starts building up in Japan, and he's part of this wave of Pure Land practice, becoming a really big part of Japanese spirituality. And he lives for a long time. He dies about age, 90 or something crazy. Yes, and then his teachings get passed on, and a couple of centuries after his death, this school actually formally gets started. Okay, so that's what happened to Shinran, and now we're going to look at, okay, so what was this? He made this dramatic shift in how he practiced when he left the monastery. And what was that shift? What did that actually look like? Okay, so I'll still tell you a bit from their point of view, and then I'll come back to kind of like how we might make sense of it, okay? So when Honen made this shift to one practice, just calling on the Buddha Amida, he was partly influenced by an idea in Japan at that time of the age of Mappo, which is a kind of like a bit of a sort of doom-laden scenario where it's like it's the third age of the Dharma, and it means that the Dharma has become degenerate and it's no longer possible by your own power to practice the Dharma or to get enlightened. Now, I don't agree with that, okay, but it was like a prevalent cultural idea in Japan at that time, probably influenced by the fairly dire circumstances that I've already kind of explained. So, Honen was feeling like these practices don't work, but it's not my personal failure. It's just like they're just not working because they can't work. But there still is a way for enlightenment to happen. And it's by relying on the vows of Dharmakara. Now, I'm kind of hoping that you've covered this in previous sessions, because this would be like a whole talk in its own right that I can't go into. But it's like this great myth about Dharmakara as a bodhisattva, a heartfelt practitioner who says, I am going to practice to save all beings, and I'm going to create a pure land where everyone can become enlightened. And then he does it, and he becomes Amida Buddha. And because he'd said, I won't become a Buddha unless if people call on my name just 10 times, they get reborn in my land, which means they'll get enlightened, I won't become a Buddha. He did become a Buddha. Therefore, if we call on his name 10 times, we're going to get enlightened. Now, if you ask me, this sounds a bit like, if I pull on my own shoelaces, I'll be able to fly to the moon, okay? So it's like we definitely have to see it in mythic terms rather than literal terms. Although I should think in a traditional society, it was much more possible to take this literally. So for Honen, practices from our own power, that wasn't going to work. So all we could do would be chant to Amida, and Amida, from all the power of his merit, that's going to save us. But it was still important that we did the chanting, like it was a partnership between like us and Amida. The deal was we did the chanting, Amida saved us, marvellous, done. Okay. Shinran takes things one step further, like to the logical conclusion, and he sort of says, well, if my own power isn't going to work, well, actually, why is my own power of chanting this random thing going to work? Why is it this not, surely me needing to chant the Nimbutsu, that's not going to work either. If my efforts don't work, they don't work. That's just how it is. So for Shinran, he takes it right back to the attitude of faith, to a mind of faith or a heart of faith arising. And for him, that's not our faith that we've generated. It's like a gift from Amida. So faith arises in us, and that's a gift from Amida. So then we would chant the Nimbutsu. Just to say, like, personally, I don't. I chant my Yidam's mantra. That's what I do. So it's like the mantra is like calling on whichever Buddha or Bodhisattva we have a connection with. Anyway, so Shinran would be chanting the Nimbutsu, like turning towards the Buddha, but just as a sort of like response to the enlightened mind, as an act of gratitude, like how amazing. I live in a universe where there are forces that are wanting me to become enlightened, that are trying to help me become enlightened. How amazing. So when Shinran talks, he talks about living the Nimbutsu, and what he's talking about is a practice, or possibly a non-practice, where, well, whatever happens, well, we're just turning towards the Buddha again and again, like, oh, I've just got really grumpy again. Namo Amida Butsu. I live in a universe where enlightenment is possible. We're just orienting again and again towards enlightenment as our potential and in the universe. So he moves from relying on self-power, his own efforts, to other power. Okay. Now, how we might understand this, because we're unlikely to be able to take the myth of Amida literally. So how we might understand this is through, there's, okay, I feel like I'm going into a different universe, which I am. I'm going out of Shinran's universe into our universe. I don't know if you've encountered the 3 myths of the spiritual life. Now, these are, so Subhuti talked about these in some talks maybe about 10 years ago, and they seem to be having a bit of a moment in the movement at the moment. But we're not talking about myths like 10 myths about house buying, or like an urban myth, like something is not true. Okay, we're talking about myth as a big story, like an overarching approach, or a kind of like how we can view our Dharma life, or the spiritual life. And what approach we take really influences what our experience of practice is. Now, when we first meet the Dharma, generally the first myth that we'll encounter is the myth of self-development. And this is really, and in a way, the Buddha taught this. So it's like, I can do it. Yeah. There's a path to follow. By my own power, I can take up practices. I can practice mindfulness. I can practice metta. I can follow the precepts. I can make creative choices. I can find the gap. I can change my habits. And every time I make a change, I make a different choice, I change who I am. I change how my mind arises in the future. So this is a myth about the path. So I'm here, the Buddha's over there, I undertake practices, and gradually I change myself. I cultivate awareness, compassion, and wisdom. And finally, through time, I become a Buddha. Okay. And, there's many advantages to this. Common sense makes sense. You try it, you think it works, you think marvellous. Okay. And it's essential and important. So it's like, don't ditch it too soon, because actually it's true. Like, we undertake practices and we change. But then what happens when we're undertaking practices and actually it feels like we don't change? So with all these approaches, it's like there's great ways of seeing things, and also we can get stuck. They have a kind of dark side to them where we can kind of get stuck in the dark side. And the dark side of self-development, I've just got completely lost in my notes. The dark side of self-development, one of the ways of seeing that is we look at the Dharma as a self-improvement project where we are never good enough. I'm not good enough, so I have to become more metaful and more mindful. But it's like we're on a treadmill. We never become the person that we want to become. And after a while, there can just be this sort of sense of failure, like Parami, I love my name, okay, but sometimes I just feel like it's slightly ironic that I've got metta in it. It's like I've been trying for 15 years to practice metta. and I can be so grumpy. I can be so grumpy. And it just feels like a total meta fail on occasion. And I've been trying for 15 years to be more mindful. And then I just dash around losing things and forgetting appointments. And, you know, I put my phone down and I can't find it. And I put my hat down and I can't find it. And then I get in a flap. And then I think, and I'm ordained. And actually, like, then we can get in a kind of like failure loop where it feels like the Dharma is saying, like, we ought to be better than we are, and we're not. You don't have to go down this hole, by the way, but clearly I can. I mean, actually, it's also interesting that Parami gave me this name with success in it, and I've got this whole thing about like success and failure. Anyhow, so I feel Shinran. Well, I don't know what Shinran was stuck in, but I know what I was stuck in. I was stuck in feeling like I just kept trying and I just kept failing. I mean, I live in a community. I can fail 20 times a day. So then we come on to the second myth, like the second kind of like big story or approach, which is self-surrender. And I think Shinran expresses this more clearly and more beautifully than anywhere else in the Buddhist tradition. So there's two aspects to this self-surrender approach for Shinran. So one is the other power aspect. So this relying on Amida. Now, what do we mean by other power? I mean, it can just sound like sort of naive, like just trust in this saviour figure. But actually, it's not really quite like that. It's more like you know, the essential Buddhist insight is that we divide experience into self and other. And actually, life, experience, reality is not divided up. There's not like me here with a kind of like big black felt tip pen drawing a line around me in here, and then other out there. That is something that we create where we have a limited idea. You know, I identify with little me, my habitual mental states. And actually, as we start practicing the Dharma and that starts opening up, we can have the experience where actually in our experience, in our awareness, there can arise, you know, maybe love like we've never felt before, or just maybe a sense of calm, like, oh, everything's all right, you know, on a deep level, things are just all right. Or maybe we experience a sense of clarity, like, I don't know, vividness, like, and so quite often it's like you can't put it into words, but you just think, oh, and I know at this moment I'm seeing things more clearly than I do in my everyday life. I know what's important. And I would say go on retreat, though that's the conditions in which this happens in your mind. Even if it's an online retreat, go on retreat. Now, sometimes when these experiences of love or openness or spaciousness or calm arise, it's like they're so unfamiliar. It's like they don't feel like us, and they can feel very strongly like it's an other power. But that's from the perspective of my little deluded mind. You know, I think, oh, Manchu Siddhi, it's like this. Those are my mental states. And as we start opening into something that is more, the experience of that can be, it feels like other power. And that can be a very, very powerful way to relate to those qualities. Like it feels like they're not in us. But in a way, we can only experience them because they are our own potential. Okay, I'm not actually going to mention the third myth of the spiritual life again, except now. Okay, so the third myth is all these qualities are within us and they will just unfold. Okay, and actually, you sort of start with self-surrender, where it feels like there's me here and there's other power out there. But where that experience ends up is realizing actually there are just these, there was this potential for our psyche, for our psyches, and actually it is possible and it will unfold, and it's neither within us nor without us. Neither of those actually makes sense. Okay, right, back to Shinran. Okay, so one pole of Shinran's self-surrender practice is just this realizing that other power is a really strong force in the universe, and we can relate to it and call on it. And we might want to call that Amida, or we might want to call it some other figure that we have a connection with. Or we might relate to it in some other way. I actually live with someone who relates to a tree as an archetypal figure that expresses reality. So you're looking for what opens you into that infinite potential. And in Shinran's practice, we're just orienting to that again and again and again. We're staying in relation to whatever is Amida for us. We turn towards it. And that has an effect on your psyche. And in a way, you need do no more. Like that will have an effect all by itself. You can just trust that that orientation again and again and again will have an effect. And that's why Shinran's practice is, every moment awareness arises, like, oh, I've just burnt my porridge. Namo Amida Butsu. Oh, look, there's a DPD parcel man at the door. Namo Amida Butsu. It's just like every time awareness arises, you just turn again, you orient again towards this infinite potential in the universe. So that's one side of it, that's one pole, the other power pole. And the other side is, so Shinran looked at his own mind, like his own little limited mind. And he called himself a bombu. He just looked at his little mind functioning, and a bombu is a silly, foolish person, like a real numpty. And he was looking at his finite, conditioned mind. And just seeing its continual self-referencing. Yes. So in a way, he's seeing his failing mind, and he's just looking at how all the time, how do I put it? The unenlightened mind, like we are at the center of our universe. So for me, everything revolves around me. So if I'm having supper with the community, and like maybe we've got some particularly nice tofu, and someone gets up to get some more, and I think, oh, will there be any left for me? Or maybe I listen to the weather forecast and I think, oh, well, it's going to be sunny, but there's no rain coming, and I've just planted some baby trees and they need some rain. I'm looking at the weather forecast thinking, well, what's in it for me? Even if I hear a kettle boiling, I think, is there enough water in it for me? And Shinran is just watching his mind do this self-referencing again and again and again. And this calculating mind, as he calls it, it doesn't just stop with everyday life. We also bring it to our spiritual practice. Oh, I got a lot out of that retreat. I don't know. That was a really good meditation for me. That really did it for me. So even with spiritual practice, we're looking for what's the payoff, what's in it for me, what am I going to get in it, what am I going to get out of this? I got a lot out of that. So there's nothing the matter with that as far as it goes. But for Shinran, that was part of where he'd just come up against a wall, where he could just see again and again the kind of basic self-referencing that saw everything in terms of what's in it for me. So he stops taking this personally and he just starts laughing at himself and just kind of going, oh yeah, there it is again. I can't change it. That's what it is to have an enlightened mind. There's my Bombu, there's my inner Bombu just doing it again. He stops taking his unenlightened mind so seriously. So these are the two poles of Shin practice, orienting towards the Buddha, towards infinite potential, and just kind of having this clarity about like what it is to be unenlightened. They just go, oh yeah, Maichi Siddhi, you've just got massively anxious again. Oh well, I'm just a Bombu, what do you expect? Oh, Maichi Siddhi, you've just got really, really annoyed at that person again. Oh well, that's just my calculating mind. Now what this does is it means we don't get into a sort of ego battle with our spiritual practice, where what we're trying to do is create a marvelous me. It's like we just sort of step out of that scenario where it's like I keep trying to make myself the right sort of person and I keep failing. So I can just step out of that kind of soap opera of the self, that kind of drama of the self, and just go, oh yeah, well that's my unenlightened mind. That's what unenlightened minds do. There's metta in there and there's forgiveness. And then we orient again, like how can we turn again towards the infinite, our potential. And Shinran calls this jinen, or naturalness. It's like we just trust to the dynamic of those two poles, seeing our own numptiness and orienting again and again towards the infinite. And jinen is naturalness, just trusting that by itself that has an effect, by itself that moves us towards enlightenment. We don't need to worry about anything else.